They say it's darkest before the dawn. Let's hope that's true, because Gaza is definitely in the dark this Tuesday. Israeli tanks cutting off the Egyptian border crossing in the southernmost city of Rafah as the coalition war cabinet rejects what Hamas brands as acceptance of a truce deal, instead reading it as an underwhelming counteroffer. The start of the all-out ground offensive that U.S. mediators, among others, fear will lead to a new level of humanitarian disaster. Now, it's been an up and down 24 hours for Gaza residents. At first, they thought that they were seeing a first ceasefire since November, that it was finally at hand, thus sparing Rafah. But maybe also it's when it all comes to a head that the real bargaining begins. What do Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar really want? Israel dispatching a mid-level delegation to Cairo. What's in their interest at this point? And how much pressure can the outside world bear to end a nightmare that is exactly 7 months old and counting? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about tanks in Rafah and talks in Cairo. With us, retired Israeli diplomat Alan Pincus. Your latest column in daily newspaper Haaretz is entitled, "For Netanyahu, It's Always 1938 and U.S. College Campuses Are Nazi Germany." Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Francois, as always.
From Washington, Hussein Ibish, senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you again, every time.
Gil Mahaley, editor-in-chief of French news website Causeur, is with us. How are you?
Great, thank you. Nice to be here.
And we welcome Tunisian journalist Shaima Garsalawi.
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. Monday evening's cheers were short-lived in Gaza. Thousands of Palestinians back to fleeing areas of Rafah, heeding the call of evacuation orders that had been dropped by Israeli planes. Tom Canetti has more.
Less than 24 hours after Palestinians celebrated what some believed was a deal reached between Israel and Hamas, the Israeli army pushes through with its operations in Rafah, where the UN estimates up to 1.5 million people are sheltering from the war. Israel's ground forces took control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing, which leads to Egypt, after crossing along the Philadelphia corridor, 14-kilometre strip of land serving as a buffer zone between the enclave and Egypt, guaranteed by the Israeli-Egyptian Peace Treaty of 1979.
I don't think Israel will approve the deal. Israel doesn't care about us or our children. Israel only cares about its own people, and Netanyahu only cares about being at the top. He doesn't care about the children.
As volatile ceasefire negotiations continue between the two sides, an Israeli government spokesperson said Hamas can end the conflict by surrendering.
This afternoon, before we here in Israel put our kids to bed, and the way it could end is quite simple. If Hamas lay down their arms and release our hostages, that is the way for this conflict to end. Hamas need to lay down their arms and give us back our hostages. That is the way for this conflict to end. Anything else where Hamas remains in power is simply not an option for Israel.
The Rafah crossing is strategically important because it is the main route for aid entering the enclave and the exit for those who are able to flee to Egypt.
Alan Pincus, we heard there that clip of the Israeli spokesperson. After that, the Prime Minister addressing a video message in Hebrew in which he said that it was an imperative to launch this operation at the border between Rafah and Egypt. The White House in the last hour saying Israel's told the U.S. that this was limited and designed to prevent weapons and funds from being smuggled into Gaza. Is it either of those, or is it part of the bargaining process?
It's everything you said in one package. First of all, it's not imperative. If it was imperative, then Israel could and should have done it in the first week or 2 weeks or month or 2 months, or indeed 3 months of the war, rather than attack in the north. So it's not imperative. And any attempt which Mr. Netanyahu has repeatedly tried to make to portray Rafah as some kind of a Stalingrad, after which, World War II, there's an inflection point, or the Battle of the Bulge, that is not the case. Now, going back to an operation in Rafah, I don't think that Mr. Netanyahu is seriously prepared for a full invasion of southern Gaza and the city of Rafah right on the border, trilateral border between Israel, Egypt, and Gaza, which is why Israeli spokespeople, anonymously, as you would imagine and you can expect, spoke of a limited operation whose intention was only to secure the Rafah crossing and then, according to one report, perhaps outsource it to some American company that would manage and run it. I don't know how accurate that report is, but I just do not see an operation going on as long as there are negotiations for a hostage deal, which in and of themselves don't seem like moving too much forward.
You agree, Gil Naheli?
Well, I think what Israel is trying to do is to introduce the salami. Of course, I'm talking about the kosher salami method to Rafah. So everyone is talking about operation in Rafah. So instead of having the big plan of going on Rafah like we did in Khan Yunis, like they did in Khan Yunis or in the north, they probably broke it down to several operations.
Let's call up a map on this
Okay.
because Palestinian civilians told to move, just so our viewers get an idea of this, told to move towards the Khan Yunis area. There you see the map, away from the Rafah crossing. There you see the blue dot is Rafah. So talk us through it then.
Okay, so you have the big urban, densely populated area of Rafah. When everyone is talking about operation in Rafah, what they see is Khan Yunis or Dir al-Balach or Gaza City. Large number of Israeli troops entering a city and working through Hamas infrastructures for 4, 5, 6 weeks with a lot of destruction. Okay? So what Israel is doing is, instead of launching this big operation that Americans are probably vetoed, they do something that could have a title, Operation and Rafah, but it's a small Rafah operation.
What's the aim?
What's the aim? The aim is we are not standing still. We continue. You can tell the public opinion. We are moving on Rafah. This is the plan. We are not doing like we did it before. It's a modular operation. It has many phases. But we started. We are operating. We told the inhabitants of Rafah to go to the safe place. It takes a few days. We give them the time to evacuate. We're starting to improve our positions. We took the border crossing. So he can say he's moving on, nothing changed, the operation is as planned. And it's the same logic from the beginning. I mean, the logic of Netanyahu is that you need to go through the whole Hamas infrastructure, all the hardware, okay, all the battalions, the underground structure, the rockets depots, everything that you can destroy physically, okay. He thinks that.
So there will be a full-scale invasion of Rafah
I don't know.
at some point.
I mean, what the message is saying, he's conveying, is that we are negotiating, but we are not stopping the military pressure.
Okay, so Hussein Ibish, it sounds, listening to Gil, that this is more about Israeli domestic public opinion than it is about the talks taking place in Cairo.
Well, I think it's partly that. For Netanyahu, yes, it's Israeli public opinion and the relationship with the United States and Joe Biden. Remember, the United States has told Israel flatly that it cannot invade Rafah, having driven half of the Gaza population, well over 1 million people, down there by design, by military policy. It was the policy of Israel backed by the United States, to force those people down into the Rafah area. And without giving them a place to go, you would simply be herding them into one spot and then massacring them or driving them across the border into Egypt or something crazy like that. And the U.S. cannot be implicated in that. So as a consequence, you've got Netanyahu fighting the ceasefire as much as possible based on Israeli public opinion, sabotaging it, not agreeing to it, refusing to show up to meetings, insisting that Rafah will happen with or without an agreement, which may be true, but it's very unhelpful to be saying that in the past 48 hours or more. At the same time, going ahead and starting the Rafah operation, but doing it in a way, a piecemeal way, that is not going to cause an incredible, unmanageable crisis with the United States. So this may be the model for how Rafah is going to be conducted. Not a big action like Khan Yunis that leaves the whole place looking like a moonscape all at once, but bits and pieces. And they began by seizing the Philadelphia corridor in the south, which was a major war aim from day one. So, it's all proceeding according to plan, I think, yeah.
So what you're saying, Hussein, is that what's happening right now in Cairo is anecdotal?
I think it's a little bit of a sideshow for Netanyahu. If he's absolutely forced by circumstances to accept a temporary agreement with Hamas that would result in the freeing of a significant number of Israeli hostages and captives, he might be forced into that. But he would only regard it as a temporary pause in the war. And I think he definitely wants to avoid it if possible. He's shown every sign in word and deed that he wants nothing to do with an agreement that would sort of pause in Israel's operations at this time.
Well, Shaima Garsalawi, let's go over the last 24 hours, because it was about this time on Monday when the newswire dispatches start ringing urgent. Hamas accepts ceasefire proposal. Turns out it was more counteroffer than it was the ceasefire proposal as formulated by the Israelis. And there were scenes of celebrations, and they were quickly dashed, of course. I just want to show you what the U.S. news website Axios has been reporting, that the government of Netanyahu, claiming privately, it was blindsided by Washington. That Israeli officials claiming that the CIA director Bill Burns, who's right now in Cairo for those negotiations, knew about the new proposal, but didn't tell Israel. There's definitely a sense that Israel sent a message to the, there's definitely, that's what they said, but a senior U.S. official pushing back in that same article saying, quote, American diplomats have been engaged with Israeli counterparts. There have been no surprises. What do you make of the last 24 hours?
So, first of all, even whether we consider it a counteroffer or not, that's how negotiations work. Each party comes with their sides, with their deals, and then concessions are made, whether for the good of one side or for the other. And accepting this ceasefire or this truce offer from Hamas puts Netanyahu in front of a few things he doesn't want to face. First, the post-war Gaza, because that's a major, major issue for Netanyahu, because the day after plan has not been made by his government. And then it puts him in front of the issue of the Israeli public opinion, because then he will be held accountable for many things, including him and his government, including the attacks of the 7th of October and a multitude of other practices that happened after. So for him, it seems like it's an imperative to elongate this war more and more. And then after what happened, the happiness and all the joy that was celebrated by the Palestinians that was seized, that was cut short, it's also, we have to consider that 1.7 million people are being told to move from Rafah to either central Gaza or Khan Yunis. And this is a place where it's fully in rubble. This is a place where they don't have access to water nor healthcare again. And when we have a complete seize of the Rafah enclave, we don't have aid trucks that are allowed to enter. And this is the recipe of a larger humanitarian catastrophe than we've ever seen before in Gaza. And when it comes to the United States officials, we're almost seeing this new approach, because after the 7th of October, obviously it changed the approach and the way we deal with the Middle East.
So the White House saying that talks on a hostage deal and ceasefire are resuming in Cairo. The CIA director, Bill Burns, is still there. And this is according to the White House spokesperson, quote, the two sides should be able to close the remaining gaps.
Absolutely. This is in alignment.
So you're saying that we could be close to a deal? You agree with what John Kirby's saying there?
I think this is what will the U.S. push for. There is an article I've read lately by Thomas L. Friedman. It's talking about the Biden doctrine and this approach that there needs to be multifaceted approach in the Middle East, including which the emergence of a Palestinian state. And I think this starts from the U.S.'s side by pushing for this deal and for this truce, because this is very crucial for the Biden campaign and also for the Biden approach to the Middle East, his cabinet.
So a couple of questions for you, Alan Pincus, on this. First of all, the panel unanimous that Benjamin Netanyahu is reluctant. He has sent, while those tanks are moving in, he has sent what the Reuters news agency describes as a mid-level delegation to Cairo. What's a mid-level delegation?
Oh, that's a delegation that has zero authority and entrusted to do nothing except show up. And that's part of his modus operandi. That's part of his antics. That's how he conducts foreign policy, by constant manipulation and games.
So when the White House spokesperson says that the two sides should be able to close the remaining gaps, is he misinformed, or does that sound like the United States is really pressuring Israel this time?
The latter rather than the former. I don't know about real pressure, because I have not seen the U.S. cross that very fine threshold between rhetoric and policy in terms of what we call pressure. They're always concerned, and they're always hopeful, and they're always disturbed, and they always urge, and they always sense. But that remains confined to the rhetoric. Look, Francois, it's very simple. Had Mr. Netanyahu wanted this deal, it could have been done 3 months ago, 2 months ago, a month ago, 3 weeks ago, a week ago, and today. He apparently does not want this. Now, I have no illusions about Hamas. This is a vile terrorist organization. But looking at Mr. Netanyahu, he has a vested interest in two things: prolonging the war and confronting the U.S., both of which are subject to his political survival, none of which has anything to do with Israel's national security.
And so these reports that have surfaced in several outlets, including the Wall Street Journal and Politico, that the U.S. is now starting to drag its feet on handing over weaponry?
Yeah, that's true. In today's relatively important day, because I think by today the administration needs to report to Congress that indeed Israel is compliant with humanitarian, international, and American law in terms of how it is using American-provided, American-supplied weapons. And I don't know what's going to come out of that. Now, it is true that the U.S. halted or delayed or put on hold one weapons shipment. On the other hand, 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Congress approved over $14 billion worth of weapons to Israel. So I don't see a major policy change. I will add one thing, and I know this deserves a different debate altogether. If you notice, President Biden and other spokespeople for his administration, Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, and others have stopped in the last 2-3 weeks talking about the so-called Biden doctrine, talking about a Palestinian state, normalization with Saudi Arabia, a reconfigured Middle East, a regional defense alliance, a bilateral. I mean, it's all been put on hold. And the question is, and the answer, I think, is that the U.S. has come to a conclusion that is very uncomfortable for me as an Israeli to admit to, but the conclusion is that Israel is the weak link here. And Mr. Netanyahu cannot be trusted as an ally to get on board this Biden idea. I wouldn't go as far as to call it a doctrine, but at least a set of principles.
So does anything get a truce over the line?
Only American pressure, and I know I'm contradicting myself right now. Only if America stands up and says enough, and you stop right now, lay down your arms, which America would not do and will not do. I had hoped at some point that there would be more public demonstration and more public resentment, given that Mr. Netanyahu did not have the basic or moral compass to resign, or at least signal his intention to resign 7 months ago, 6 months ago, and leading to today.
Hussein Ibish, with each month that passes, Benjamin Netanyahu is still in power, and with each month that passes, Joe Biden is drawing closer to his re-election bid, and we know that Republicans are united and Democrats are divided.
Well, yes, but I still don't think anybody who is a poker player would want to have Donald Trump's hand in a game rather than Joe Biden's hand in a game. Now, that's not to say that Joe Biden is necessarily going to win, but I think the deck is very strongly stacked in his favor in many ways. On the other hand, this crisis with Israel that Alon was just describing isn't about Joe Biden's re-election. Americans are not going to vote on foreign policy unless other Americans are getting killed in large numbers. There's no war that the United States is currently involved in, like Iraq or Vietnam or anything where the election swings on that. It's going to be about the economy, the border, abortion, things like that. And so what you're really talking about, well, I think what Alon was talking about, what all of us have been talking about during this program, Francois, is the crisis between the U.S. and Israel tout court. It doesn't matter who the Israeli government is unless there's a change of policy in Israel, especially on the Palestinian state. You know, look at the crisis. The broader you draw the lines, the worse it gets. The argument between Washington and West Jerusalem about Gaza and Rafah is tactical. It's not about if, it's about when and how. You look at the argument over a Lebanon war, it becomes strategic and categorical. The U.S. is totally opposed to an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and many senior Israelis in the War Cabinet who seriously want to do that later this year. And finally, when it comes to the Palestinian state, which is about American strategic vision and Israel's own self-definition. You know, does it include big chunks of the West Bank necessarily, or can there be a Palestinian state? Then the division is categorical, it's baked in, and unless you get a bunch of Armageddon-crazed evangelicals taking over U.S. foreign policy who want to support a greater Israel in hopes of spurring the second coming of Jesus Christ and the wiping out of all non-Christians, then it's going to be a real crisis between Israel and the United States into the foreseeable future.
Speaking of religious zealots, Gil Mehaley, at this point in time, the far-right partners of Benjamin Netanyahu, do they matter in this conversation? I mean, there was talk at the end of last week. I saw some Israeli media talking about whether or not Netanyahu might want to ditch his far right and instead go for a grand coalition.
I don't think so. I think that he said early during this crisis, when people talked to him about other options, he said, yes, but what about my 64? Because he has this 64 block, and Netanyahu will not give up. Will not give up the 64.
And 61 is the magic number in the.
No, it's you need even more than that. You need really that there will be a majority against the government, and then you need to. It's quite complicated, and I don't see in the near future.
So he's going to stick with his coalition.
He's going to stick with the coalition. I mean, Netanyahu has he's working in 2 time frames. The next hour. And in 2,000 years. So let's see how we can survive until tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, how can we survive until tonight? And thinking about how we'll be remembered in history in 1,000 years or 200 years. Between the two, he thinks that you just need to play. And I will just add to the equation that to use the poker metaphor, that actually Trump is a wild card. No one knows exactly what will be his policy. And when I say no one, it's including Trump himself. So Israel could find itself in a year, just a little bit less than a year, in January of 2025, if Trump is elected, with an even more difficult American player to move on.
Why would it be more difficult with Trump?
Because he's unpredictable. Because he can, for example, he already said that this war is that he has a personal grudge against Netanyahu, that he was disappointed by Netanyahu, and when Trump holds a grudge against someone, even the interest of the world and the United States will not stand between him and a nice revenge.
Shaima Garsalawi, you agree?
One of the journalists of The Atlantic, when meeting with Jared Kushner, said about Trump, nobody can go as low as the president. And I think that's the part of the unpredictability of him dealing, especially with foreign counterparts. And he had many declarations, including to the CNN, talking about how Netanyahu has held almost hostage the United States foreign policy. And that seems to be also the realization that a lot of U.S. Officials are coming to, that if they are going to move forward with what they intend to do in the region, they will probably need to push forward for a different counterparty in Israel. And for now, what we're seeing also, that, like Mr. Pincus said, nothing is really happening on the practical level. It's more of a rhetoric that we're seeing from the U.S. It's almost like it's waiting out events to unfold and then deal with the consequences of what's happening.
There is, though, okay, I'm putting it out here, playing devil's advocate. Perhaps Israel is also forcing the issue now in Cairo with those talks. There's a definite sense that it sent a message to the other mediating party, that's Qatar, what with Sunday's raid on the Jerusalem office of Al Jazeera, which under a cabinet decision, which Netanyahu said was unanimous, included pulling the license for the Doha satellite news channel. Equipment was confiscated. There was the pulling of accreditation for 45 days. The move is not applicable to Gaza and the West Bank. Just in terms of negotiations, and I'll put it to you, Alan Pincus, that plus what's going on now at closing the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip in Rafah, again, could that all force the issue and perhaps lead to a breakthrough at the bargaining table?
Sometimes, Francois, being a devil's advocate is not a good idea. Okay, you'll get the devil. I'm sorry about the advocacy. Look, the decision to shut down Al Jazeera was silly and myopic and just plain dumb. You can have just a justified criticism, and you can have resentment, and you can profoundly dislike and disapprove of how they do their operation. Okay, there's a timing issue. Qatar has been nothing but helpful and stellar in their attempts to mediate. I'm not talking about the grand picture of Israelis now deflecting and projecting their own deficiencies on Qatar, as if Qatar supported Hamas without Israeli consent or without Israeli approval. Now, the decision was also silly because this is a time when Israel is increasingly isolated in the world. So I just don't see this as having anything to do with the negotiations going on. By the way, closing down Al Jazeera has been something that this government has been toying and flirting with for a long time, irrespective of the war in Gaza. And let's not forget, although it's, sort of out of the purview of this discussion, Francois, for the 9 months preceding the war in Gaza, Israel was shaken and devastated by a constitutional coup instigated by this man who you're showing right now, Netanyahu, who, among other things, was trying to curtail media freedoms. So I would attach this Al Jazeera move to that rather than to any negotiation.
Are we focusing, Gil Mehaly, too much on Benjamin Netanyahu? He says that the decision was unanimous. That means there's a war cabinet coalition. Does that mean that Benny Gantz...
what are you talking about, Al Jazeera?
Yes, Al Jazeera. He was privy to that.
I think that Al Jazeera is really a symbolic measure. As Mr. Pinker said earlier, I think Netanyahu is talking about it since 2017. It's a kind of a trick you pull out of your hat when you have nothing else. It's not the main issue. I think it's been said before. The main issue is the strategy for the day after. I think there are very few people who think that Hamas is a positive actor and he should play an important role in the future of the region. The question is, where do you want to go? And there was a strategy on the table. I don't know how serious it was, but people talked about it seriously. That all Netanyahu needed to say that in the long run, the only solution inevitably is a two-state solution. And I think it was enough for the Saudis to move forward. And the only kind of victory that I can see for Israel in this conflict is the opening ceremony of Israeli embassy in Riyadh or something of the such, or the first El Al airplane that is landing in Riyadh International Airport. This is the only victory you can really aspire to. It will be a big blow for Hamas. It will be a big blow for Iran. It will be a very important change in the geopolitical tectonic plates in the area. Everything else is much less important. Since Netanyahu didn't deliver that, we are stuck with micro tactics.
Hussein Ibish.
I apologize, Gil. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to amplify what you're saying. I completely agree with you. And I think the Americans and the Saudis have been working very hard on, the bilateral elements of that potential three-way agreement. And they're very close. They basically have an agreement on the new defense treaty, which would look something like the agreement with Japan from 1953. And therefore less than NATO, but still clarifying in a big way the defense commitment of the United States to Saudi Arabia in writing and ratified by the Senate, and the agreement for U.S. oversight and control of a Saudi nuclear energy program where they use their own uranium and don't ship it out and bring it back in and all that. They just have it there, but under American oversight. There are some details on that to be worked out, but what I'm saying is the bilateral element here between the U.S. and the Saudis is more or less agreed. The problem is none of it can work unless it's coupled with a Saudi normalization with Israel, and that requires Israel to accept the principle of a Palestinian state and get involved in some kind of a process that theoretically would end up with the creation of a Palestinian state. And this government in Israel cannot do that, apparently, in spite of the fact that relations with Washington depend on it in the long run, the relations with Saudi Arabia depend on it in the long run, that Israel's security is going to be greatly enhanced by that. There are people in this cabinet who are so attached religiously.
But you heard Gil saying there, Hussein, how that coalition is not going anywhere for now in Israel.
Yeah, and in fact, I wonder, and I'm skeptical, whether there's any potential government in Israel that is viable and that would survive for, long enough to get this done, that is capable of accepting the principle of a Palestinian state, just even the idea of it as a necessary goal. My sense is there isn't one. I hope I'm wrong about that.
Can I add something, Francois?
Alan Pincus.
Yeah, I got to say something. 20 years ago, when I was blonde and Hussein Ibish went to the opera twice a week, we debated many times on CNN, on MSNBC, and even once at Yale University in front of, Yale Law School. The exact issue that we're discussing, the five of us right here today, it's unbelievable, inconceivable that 20 years, maybe even more, went by and we're still having the same damn discussion.
And here we are 20 years later, and we're seeing, by the way, in the United States, it's graduation week at some U.S. campuses. The bitterness there is palpable. We can perhaps show you images from Monday. This is at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, outside of Boston. They were pro-Palestinian demonstrators. They were pro-Israel demonstrators. It's not much of a dialogue right now. The Baltimore Sun and The Economist cartoonist Cal bemoans the polarization and lack of nuance. Here you see two people shaking hands, saying we should talk, and all the others pointing fingers. Shaima Garsalawi, I mean, this is the same on this side of the Atlantic. A moment ago, Gil Mehaley was talking about the possibility of a breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that there could be some kind of way where at least the needle moves in some parts of the Middle East. But now it doesn't seem like it's 7 months, again, 7 months and counting. It doesn't look like it's possible.
The U.S. will definitely push for that breakthrough with Saudi Arabia and Israel, also knowing the major factor that is Iran in the region. However, for me, it doesn't seem that it's possible because one, like Mr. Hussein said, for the normalization to happen, there needs to be a premise or a talk about a two-state solution, and that ties to post-war Gaza with destroyed infrastructure, with also those issues with Hamas. That ties also to the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority. And if there is going to be a unified authority that ties Gaza and the West Bank, that's going to be the counterpart for an Israeli government potentially to talk about the two-state solution. So for me, that doesn't seem feasible under the current conditions. Also, when we're talking about a normalization, we seem to rule out a major factor, which is public opinion. And now, after what happened for the entirety of 7 months after the 7th of October, the public opinion is not going to be welcoming of this normalization. And we see the pushback, whether here in France, whether in the United States, but also in the Arab world and in the Middle East. And that will cause a major issue for a lot of people and a lot of governments in the Middle East whose also rule is very, very fragile. And it requires one spark for it to go south for these governments.
But as Hussein Ibish said, it's not American or French soldiers that are fighting right now.
Absolutely, but still what we're seeing right now also, including French institutions and including the French public opinion, for example, it seems to be a swing towards more this idea that the Palestinian state, the idea that a ceasefire, also the larger criticism of the Israeli government.
Okay, so Shaima, you were not in the audience when Hussein and Alan were debating at Yale Law School 20 years ago. For younger people, does this just seem like a frozen conflict?
It doesn't seem like a frozen conflict. It seems like a conflict where the people are not heard and politicians seem to be out of touch. For me and for a lot of young people who are in universities, what we're talking about the concrete applications of these solutions that seem to remain theoretical, that seem to remain in the realm of diplomacy without actually talking about the practical implementation. If we're talking a Palestinian state, let's see how we can implement that state and how would that play out on the ground. We have a destroyed Gaza. We have a West Bank that's ruled by a Palestinian Authority that's fragile. It doesn't seem to find legitimacy among its own people. So if we're talking about a Palestinian state, what young people hope to hear is a practical plan to implement that.
Gil Mehaley, some people say, it's erupting now on campuses at Cambridge University. We could have shown scenes of that taking place this week as well. Others saying, well, demonstrations are small.
Depends where. I think in the United Kingdom they are quite important, and it's very interesting to understand why. In the American campuses also, not all of them, there are hundreds of universities in the United States. But in France, for example, it's quite marginal. There were a few demonstrations in October and November. Very little since. The universities are not really showing much enthusiasm. So it's different from one country to the other. But in order, we've been quite critical towards Netanyahu and Israel. Netanyahu deserves it, but Netanyahu is not only the cause; he's also the result of what happened in the 2000s. The fact that the Israeli retreat from Gaza in 2005 didn't have any positive outcome. The fact that the Olmert proposal of September 2008 didn't have the echo it deserved in the Palestinian side made Netanyahu's victory in 2009 almost inevitable. So it's not as if we have on one side a moderate peace-searching party, on the other side warmongering Israelis. It's more complicated than that. Most of the things we said about Netanyahu, and even maybe worse, we can say about Sinwar and about the Hamas. We're saying that Israel doesn't have a day after strategy. What is Hamas' day after strategy? What did they think will happen after an October 7th? So Iran is improvising. Iran didn't push the button in Gaza in October, like they didn't push the button in Lebanon in 2006. They have very complicated relations with their allies, which are not proxies. They are not marionettes. So
not puppets.
Not puppets, exactly. So I mean, there are a lot of moving parts in this picture, and Netanyahu bears a lot of responsibility, but not all of it.
Right. I agree with that, but can I just say, it's still true, despite all of those complications that are all correct and everything that Gil said is right. However, it's still the reality that there is still a simple reality, which is that Israel can choose to deal with and seriously talk to and strengthen the Palestinians who are committed to making a deal with Israel by talking to Israelis, that is, say, the PLO, the PA, and all the Fatah-led groups, or to continue to deal mainly through violence, mutual violence, with the Palestinians who want to kill Israelis, that is, say, Hamas and Islamic Jihad. And it was Netanyahu's policy to keep both of them in power. Hamas in Gaza in power, weakened and contained and continuously broken down, but in power. And the Fatah, the PA in power in the West Bank, weakened, made to look ridiculous, making no gains towards independence. And this divide and rule policy is exactly what inevitably produced October 7. And so Israel has a choice now. Is it going to continue on that path, or is it going to take the Palestinians who want to make a deal seriously, promote them, strengthen them, and deal with them? The answer so far is no, which is amazing.
Alan Pincus, very briefly, because we're out of time. We saw a demonstration Monday night in Tel Aviv of support for the hostages in Gaza. It's been 7 months. If those hostages do not come home alive, how much will that tear apart Israel?
Tremendously. I mean, the reason that you have not seen large-scale demonstrations is due to two things. One is just fatigue. Three things, actually. One is fatigue after 9 months of demonstrating on the democracy issue. The second is devastation and agony in the aftermath of October 7th, and that has not abated. And third, perhaps more importantly, the Israeli psyche. You don't demonstrate when there's a war going on because your son is in the army, your father is in the army, your cousin, your neighbor, your best friend, whomever. But I think the resentment and the anger towards Netanyahu is going to reach a critical mass that will explode, politically that is, in the event that there's no deal, that there's no hostage deal. Because I got it, it's been talked before and you asked me to be brief. He has no plan. It's not just the day after. He has no plan for Gaza. He has no plan for the West Bank. He has no plan for Israel. And he mismanaged this debacle in the worst of ways. And this resentment, this critical mass that is going to rely on 9 months of pro-democracy, and added to which is the absence of a hostage deal, will at some point erupt.
Alan Pincus, so many thanks for being with us from Tel Aviv. I want to thank Hussein Ibish in Washington, Shaima Garsalawi, Gil Mahaley. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.